Well, I want to welcome you to the presentation this evening on dialectical behavior therapy and modern psychoanalysis. As Lisa introduced me, I am Dr. Christopher Deussing, and I am really excited to present today. And I've been looking forward to this and really appreciate the opportunity here. And that's what I was thinking of during my gratitude. Appreciative of Lisa and Ray for helping with the organization and everyone showing up here to hold space for the presentation and the knowledge that I'm going to share with you today. So before we get to the genesis of DBT, just a rough outline here. What I'm going to do is present a bit about the background of DBT, the history of it, and then go through the theoretical constructs of it. And then in a very short amount of time, I'm going to try to give everyone a flavor of the structure of DBT, the biosocial theory behind it, and then we will go into the 4 modules of DBT: mindfulness, interpersonal effectiveness, distress tolerance, and emotional regulation. Now, while I'm going through the modules, what I'm going to be doing is infusing connections between modern psychoanalysis and DBT. I thought about doing this presentation in a more divided manner in terms of I'll present the DBT and then I'll present the modern psychoanalysis and then I'll integrate. I decided to do this in a more organic manner. So these slides are meant as a guide. If something occurs to me, of course, I will possibly say everything and free associate in the spirit of the talking cure of modern psychoanalysis. With questions and answers, we will have time for questions and answers. Ray is going to be monitoring the chat. I'm not going to be keeping an eye on the chat. However, if you have thoughts, ideas, impressions, questions, please drop them in the chat. And Ray is going to do his best to organize those and be able to, so that I can get to as many of those as possible in the question and answer portion of this presentation. So, in helping you to navigate the slide, you're going to note on this first slide, there is a blue link. Throughout this presentation, there are a number of hyperlinks that most of them link up to YouTube videos that illustrate core DBT skills through DBT-RU, which is in Rutgers University. They've made a wonderful series of videos with DBT that are cartoons, but not too silly and really actually profound in the way they're able to present the skills. I use these videos in training sessions, in groups, in training my staff, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to go on every single video. So what I encourage people to do is with the slides, after the presentation, when you have time, feel free to go to the other hyperlinks and explore. This presentation is meant to light some fires about DBT. There's no way I'm going to extensively train everyone in DBT in a mere hour and a half. However, just trying to light some fires and kick the tires and get some curiosity going. Also, too, about the intersectionality and integration that we have between DBT, third, fourth wave behaviorism, and the more classic schools of thought. So with that being said, let's talk about the genesis of DBT. Dr. Marshall Lenihan, if you have not heard of Dr. Marshall Lenihan, that is a name that you should know. If an analogy is to be, Freud is to psychoanalysis, Dr. Lenihan is to dialectical behavior therapy.
1920 South Sardane Street.
Okay, so 1920 Dardane Street. However, in the 1970s, as I said, Lenahan created DBT. And the cool thing with DBT is that he created DBT through her lived experience with mental illness. Dr. Lenahan spent a good part of her youth growing up institutionalized, highly suicidal, self-harming. No one could help her get better. And then she had what she likened to be a spiritual awakening at the base of the Virgin Mary statue. And this is a short video from the New York Times. This is a New York Times article, The Power of Helping Others. I encourage people to look it up. It paints Lenahan in a very human picture. And this just kind of captures the essence of where DBT came from. So I'm going to play this quick. Let me know if the sound is good.
I was sitting in the sitting room right outside the chapel, which I will never forget because I was sitting on the couch and I think I felt complete and total despair is the only way to say how I felt. And so this nun walked by and she turned and looked at me and said, is there anything I can do for you? And I realized that no one could help me, that just no one could help me. So I said to her, I said, no, thank you. And she left. And so I got up and I went into the chapel. And I was just kneeling there. And I have no idea. I doubt seriously I was saying anything. I think I was just looking at the cross above the altar. And then out of the blue, out of the absolute blue, suddenly everything went gold and the crucifix started shimmering and the room was shimmering. And I had this unbelievable experience of God loving me. And I jumped up and ran out and ran to my room. And I was standing in my room and I said, I think out loud, I said, I love myself. And the very minute the word myself came out of my mouth, I knew I had been completely transformed. Because up until that point, I would have never said that. I would have said, I love you, because I had no sense of myself. I thought of myself as you. And the minute the word myself came from my mouth, I knew, and I've always known ever since, that I would never, ever cross that line again to being crazy.
I like to introduce this because a lot of times when people think of DBT, and earlier in Lenahan's career, she was very opaque about her background. She would not share. If you read the New York Times article, it was a very long time to where she became transparent about the personal side of DBT. So in addition to being a very behaviorally oriented modality, I really like to stress the humanity of it and the fact that this came from her lived experience, her pain and suffering, her experience trying to navigate something that people could not help her with. And then he decided to go to school. He went to University of Washington, studied clinical psychology, and then decided to work with two challenging client populations, chronically suicidal individuals and individuals with borderline personality disorder. So at this time, we really had the exponential growth of CBT. Everything was cognitive behavioral therapy. Beck had the scene on fire. And so Lenahan tried to implement standard CBT with these populations. And these are the problems. These are the three problems that she encountered. Off the bat, clients experienced change focus interventions as invalidating. Um, this invalidation caused treatment interfering behaviors, which DBT is called TIBs. In terms of modern psychoanalysis, we may think of them as treatment destructive resistances, hostility towards therapists, or both. And then clients and therapists with standard CBT reenacted repetition cycles where progressive work was compromised by avoidance and redirection. When pressed towards change, clients reacted with resistance. When therapists were more permissive, clients responded with the kindness, positivity. These oscillating patterns, they could deceive both clients and therapists into believing they were making progress when really they were co-constructing ineffectual feedback loops, feeding into status quo resistances, and just on that therapeutic merry-go-round. And lastly, Lenehan noted that due to crises, a lot of times people in stage 1 DBT who are really struggling, the crises will be relentless. It'll be crisis of the day or crisis of the week. But due to ongoing crises, therapists and clinicians, they use large amounts of resources attending to safety concerns, which left inadequate resources for teaching coping skills and targeting behavioral functioning, behavioral stability, which we'll see is the #1 priority in the early stages of DBT. In response to these challenges, Dr. Lenehan modified CBT, and this is really important. A lot of people are confused that DBT and CBT are separate, and that is a misunderstanding. DBT has come from CBT. In some ways, it's a modification, it's a remix, it's a form, it's a customization of CBT. So it's important to recognize that connection and also give credit where credit's due to Beck and his colleague for setting the platter for DBT to be created. Now, one of the biggest modifications here, and this is huge, especially in these modern solution-focused brief therapy, time-limited therapy, the era of time-limited therapy, and being said, oh, we have to fix things. We really have to change things. First thing Lenehan did was adopting an acceptance-based orientation before concentrating on change. So instead of immediately trying to identify dysfunctional cognitive patterns or beliefs and then trying to reframe or correct them, Lenehan decided to operate initially from acceptance-based orientation, accepting what the client is saying, validating their experience, validating their individualized truth, right? Before moving to change orientation. This can be very hard. I struggle with this to this very day in terms of wanting to change things instead of just laying back and accepting. I also think this acceptance-based orientation integrates well with the modern psychoanalytic technique of joining. We have to join clients where they're at before immediately moving to dystonic. Before being ego dystonic, we have to join the ego and mirror and reflect and validate and be curious. Right? I just want to say that acceptance does not necessarily mean agreement. We'll talk more about that with the skill of radical acceptance. And then the second thing is Lenehan decided to incorporate dialectical philosophy into treatment. Dialectics, there's a little more on the next slide. However, just very quickly, dialectics are a pole of two opposing schools of thought or emotions. An emotional dialectic, a good example would be happiness or joy on one side and sadness on the other. So dialectic philosophy allows for the mutual existence of both of those emotions. Not one is right or wrong. They both can coexist. An individual can be happy and sad at the same time, right? And what this inclusion of dialectics allows is it lets clients and therapists synthesize polarized opposites. So, for example, acceptance and change. A client can not want to make change or not be ready, and we can accept that. And the client can also want to change too. Willfulness versus willingness, or resistance, right? Resistance can exist in the form of ambivalence. One part can be resistant, and the client again can also want to change. So it allows for a lot of gray areas, whereas before, Lenahan in standard DBT was getting hung up on a lot of the black and whites that not incorporating a dialectical philosophy can reinforce. So the therapeutic dyad with this dialectical philosophy, it can avoid polarized positions, it can avoid patterns of radical and oppositional position taking, and help strengthen therapeutic rapport and therapeutic relationship. In the years since Lenahan introduced DBT and the original manual in the 1990s, and now since 2015, we've been working with the second edition of the Lenahan manual. DBT has really expanded in reach. There's extensive research supporting its effectiveness with a widening variety of client populations. A lot of people associate DBT with the original diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. It's the gold standard for that. It is one of the gold standards in the United States for the treatment of borderline personality disorder. However, now it's widely indicated. And we'll get into their reasons for that a little bit later. Let's get into a little bit of the theoretical constructs of dialectical behavior therapy. And the first one I want to talk about is the biosocial model. So DBT uses a behavioral science biosocial model to explain how mental illness, specifically with classic DBT, borderline personality disorder, manifests. One thing I want to delineate here is we note a lot of times we are talking about biopsychosocial model, right? So we're noting that DBT here doesn't have any room for the psych, right? We're focused on biology and social, no psych here. And this is where I think integration of modalities like modern psychoanalysis, psychodynamics, relational attachment theories, things like that, can provide that kind of psych component that DBT does not. So this biosocial model, biologically, this model states that certain individuals are born with a predisposition to emotional vulnerability. Genetically, or we have predispositions to one, emotional sensitivity in terms of feeling things bigger than other people. Some people just feel really big emotions. And also some people have emotional hyperreactivity and then are slow to come back to baseline, right? Now, the social component that comes into play in this biosocial model is unstable and invalidating environments that lack structure and stability can activate and exacerbate this emotional susceptibility. So we start to think of how things like complex trauma or growing up in a neglectful household, or even from the very beginning, attachment theory, mother and child, right? Secure attachment from the beginning, attentiveness to child. If we do not have stability and a validating and an accepting and a safe and stable environment, and an individual has this predisposition, all of a sudden, this can set up a very vulnerable space where destructive patterns of interaction are happening. These patterns can then harm relationships and overall functioning. And then over time, repetition, such as with complex trauma, relational trauma, right? Microaggressions and trauma over periods of time, they can result in self-harm, suicidality, and then unfortunately, over a long enough period of time, become a deep, enduring personality disorder, such as borderline personality disorder. Second foundational construct of DBT is Zen Buddhism. I also like to highlight this and use this slide. DBT and Dr. Lenehan, in all her brilliance, did not come up with mindfulness. Mindfulness has been around for thousands upon thousands of years. Okay, mindfulness, even too, if we're to look at it from a modern psychoanalytic standpoint, in terms of lay, say, pay, right? Get on the couch and say everything. In terms of, I had an aha moment. This was a long time ago. I was in session and client was free associating beautifully on the couch, and I was struck by, wow, this is pretty much a verbal meditation. This is a form of mindfulness. So the Zen Buddhist mindfulness techniques, they're foundational to DBT. And with mindfulness, it helps clients access their here and now presence of mind. Beck says, I love this quote, there's nothing other than this present moment. There's no past, there's no future, there's nothing but this. So when we don't pay attention to each little this, we miss the whole thing. By cultivating a client's ability, a patient's ability to access the here and now presence of mind, that paves the way for them to be able to activate what's called wise mind, to evaluate situations more calmly and effectively. We'll be talking about wise mind in a couple slides here. And mindfulness is really key here, and this is a big component of DBT here in terms of evaluating and trying to create change. It allows clients to assess their present experience, check the facts, diffuse away from emotions, check the facts, and break ineffectual behavioral, cognitive, and emotional chains. Then these chains can be replaced with more effective processes. The link here down here is a wonderful video on DBT chain analysis from Rutgers. However, it's about 8 minutes long, and I'll leave people to watch that at their own discretion. But with chain analysis, just quickly, what we're doing is becoming very granular in analyzing the links between behaviors, emotions, and thoughts and environment. So, for example, if the client experiences an anger outburst, I may ask them to perform a chain analysis on that. And that will include, what was the prompting event? What gave rise to the anger? I know for me, one of my weak spots is standing in line. That can be a prompting event, right? All of a sudden, that can lead to, okay, what's the next chain in that? Is that a cognitive interpretation? Like a cognitive interpretation might be, wow, I can't believe this line at the supermarket's so long. It shouldn't be this way. All of a sudden, that feeds the anger, right? And then, are there any pre-existing vulnerability? Have I eaten lunch? Have I drank enough water? That might be exacerbating the anger even more. So getting very granular and examining each chain in that reaction that's led to that emotion. This is exciting for me with chain analysis because if we can figure out the weakest part of the chain or the most accessible part of the chain that we can address with skills, that can be our intervention point. There isn't necessarily one right or wrong intervention. So, for example, with the standing in the supermarket, if I haven't drank enough water, perhaps I pick up a bottle of water at the aisle and drink it, right? Perhaps if the line is too long, right, I just take a break from the line and leave the supermarket for a second, right? Perhaps I can do a cognitive reframe in terms of, oh, okay, it shouldn't be this way. Well, really, this is life, and life isn't fair, and I'm in line, so I'm going to make the best of it. So we can see how chain analysis opens up multiple points of intervention. So let's talk a little bit about dialectical philosophy. Dialectical philosophy was developed by a number of philosophers. It starts back in ancient Greek times with Socrates and all that. However, a lot of people associate Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel, with dialectics, the conceptualization of we have a thesis and an antithesis, and that dialectic leads to a synthesis, right? I really like this video that explains Hegelian dialectics in 3 minutes.
So that was this German guy named George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. But since we're good friends, let's just call him Hegel. Hegel was one of those philosopher guys, as in he thinks and talks a lot to the annoyance of his friends and families. But then one day he thought of this great idea and decided to write it down. The idea was dialectical arguments. So what is dialectical arguments? Asked Hegel. Before we can answer that, let's talk about truth. There's a lot of debate around the truth, whether we can find it, whether it exists at all. But one thing that all the big brains philosophers agreed on is that the truth is really complicated and really hard to grasp with. Hence the truth is represented by this lock. And like all locks, it needed a key to be opened. And like all naughty philosophers, Hegel wanted to open the truth. So through years of hard work and education, Hegel found the key for the lock. And he called it dialectical arguments. Hegel then used dialectical arguments to unlock the truth. Good for him. So where do we begin our search for dialectical arguments? Well, like all good devices, it begins with an argument. In this case, a thesis is formed. It's important to point out that Hegel didn't actually use these terminologies in his writings. The concept of thesis and antithesis was coined by Kant, who was a villain from the hit sci-fi series Star Trek. A thesis could be anything from, I think pineapple on pizza tastes good, to something like, water is a liquid. Now that we have a thesis, the next part of the puzzle is the antithesis, a contradiction. Now be aware that an antithesis need not be a direct opposite of the thesis. In most cases, it should be a counter-argument that put the thesis into question. I like to call it the actually statement. In my experience, the actually is best visualized to be spoken by an annoying character. So for this example, let's imagine Hegel saying something along the line of, actually, when water is boiled at 100 degrees Celsius, it transitions from a liquid state to a gas state. Ugh, I know, right? So what now? You have two statements that by their own only tell a small portion of the truth, but when worked together, the thesis and the antithesis create something entirely new. Hegel calls this the synthesis, and the synthesis is as close as you can get to the truth, given the information you have available. So by combining these two arguments, you realize that water can either be a liquid or a gas, depending on the temperature. But what about ice, the solid state of water? Well, this goes into Hegel's constant state of motion that all things go through in his writing. This means that you can always question what you've learned by creating a new argument against it, from which you can synthesize a better, fuller truth. First, finding truth is a process that requires the acknowledgement of two contradicting arguments. Second, finding truth is a process of synthesizing two contradicting arguments. And third, Finding truth is a constant process of finding new information to put into question what you have previously learned.
One of the things too I love about dialectics is there's really no endpoint. There's always this kind of ongoing search for knowledge. Uh, there is not this final interpretation or endpoint. And I think that spirit of curiosity is also something that really integrates well with the modality of modern psychoanalysis and saying everything, being curious about what the next thing to be said is, being curious about changing the periods at the end of patient sentences to ellipses. And what is next? What is next? Say more about that, please. So one of the most important things about dialectical philosophy and DBT is that it acknowledges and validates individualized truths that may not survive logical analysis, but can be comprehended within the context of one inner frame of reference. So it's important to acknowledge and validate the presence of concurrent realities. So Ray's reality, as he's experiencing it right now in this Zoom room with me, is different than my reality. The emotions that Ray's having are different than Lisa's, or perhaps some are the same, right? The same that Dr. Cameron, his experience, his truth of this presentation is different than everyone else's in here. And this is really important to come back to that acceptance, right? To realize that there is no mono truth here, that every truth is valid and open to being explored. So with clients and therapists, they use dialectical philosophy and DBT to guide the treatment and therapeutic relationship. A good example of this is this foundational dialectic of acceptance versus change. In terms of guiding the treatment, perhaps one session, 1 week is more on the change element, where the therapist is more of an interventionist. Perhaps the session the next week is more of an acceptance, and where the therapist is just providing a safe holding environment for the patient to free associate. Another point I want to flesh out about dialectics is with parts work. A lot of attention and a lot of momentum in our current therapeutic landscape is going to IFS, internal family system. You hear parts work all the time. However, parts work was around long before IFS. We had schema therapy, Gestalt. We also have the shadow sides of Jungian analysis. Of course, Freud talking about the unconscious, subconscious, various parts of self, right? Dialectics are a wonderful construct to help clients accept parts of themselves that they do not like and generate motivation towards integrating those parts, integrating those splits. The synthesis of these opposites can resolve tensions, moving therapy forward. So I find that dialectics can be very helpful in terms of incorporating parts work or elements of parts work into the therapeutic arena. Let's talk about the structure of DBT really quick. And here too, making the delineation between adherent DBT. So adherent DBT is right now delineated by clinicians who hold a DBT LBC by the Lenahan Board of Certification that credential. In terms of the DBT LBC, many of those clinicians are practicing DBT in adherent form. Now, what that means is it's being delivered in 4 stages, which we'll get into the 4 stages. And the DBT is being delivered in at least weekly individual therapy sessions, where clients are filling out diary cards that are combinations of mood trackers, tracking also prompting events, and self-harm behaviors. along with skills usage. Um, Group therapy, which is more of a classroom format with beginners DBT, where clients are learning skills and talking about how they are practically applying them to their lives. In beginners DBT, there isn't much processing going on in group. That's mainly saved for the individual therapy component. However, once an individual moves into more intermediate and advanced DBT treatments, then the modality can open up a bit where group can be a balance of process along with skills, not even necessarily training. If clients have had enough training, they'll bring the skills themselves into group. And then something that's very unique to DBT is phone coaching in between sessions. Phone coaching being several minutes, mini coaching sessions prevent self-harm. A client cannot call for phone coaching after they have self-harmed. It can only be done before self-harm, and the client agrees, they're willing to follow the directions of the therapist. So again, not processing, coaching. Are you using this skill? What's the problem? What are our objectives, and what are the skills that we're using? Okay, try and do that, and then I'll then check in 5 minutes if you need to. This can be really helpful in terms of live skills training. As people stabilize and move through the stages of DBT, the need for phone coaching lessens. Phone coaching, though, is a vulnerable thing with DBT because it's a high demand on the therapist in terms of being on call and being more available than most therapists. There are ways to mitigate this. When I practiced on a DBT adherent team, we would rotate a phone for phone coaching for 1 week at a time. There's also thoughts in terms of, I've had thoughts in terms of where technology and perhaps something like AI, this may be something where technology can fill some of the need, not replacing live phone coaching, but perhaps adjunctive apps and things like that are in development. Because with DBT, there is a high risk of burnout. One, because if you're doing adherent DBT with high risk populations, that itself is a risk factor. And then with phone coaching and this intensive therapy kind of setup, it can burn therapists out pretty quick. The stage one DBT. Stage one DBT is what most people associate with DBT. This is where we're focusing on safety, crisis intervention, and stabilization. All we're focusing on here is behavioral control. This is where clients are struggling with life-threatening behaviors. Oftentimes the motto here, I remember when I was practicing at Belmont in Philadelphia, was let's keep the client alive, right? So we're dealing with life-threatening behaviors, the treatment interfering behaviors, treatment disruptive resistances, and also major quality of life concerns. Here, we're just trying to gain some control over problem behaviors. Deeper emotional issues are shelved until one is committed to the therapeutic process and has skills to regulate the emotions without resorting to harmful behaviors. And Lenahan says here, in the first stage, the focus is to get behavioral control. The focus on this stage is on keeping the patient alive and gaining the required skills and quality of life necessary to work on any further goals. I might add to this too, that there is community as well. Oftentimes with DBT programs, since you're in individual therapy and group therapy and phone coaching, you become part of a plug and play community pretty quickly that can really help with stabilization and accountability in this stage of treatment. And Lenahan, at this stage of treatment, here you really can't think yourself into new ways of acting. You can only act yourself into new ways of thinking. This is reflective of the behavioral focus at this point. This is a bit of an absolutist quote. I think that we move to later stages of DBT, we can think our way into new ways of acting. However, at this stage, oftentimes the cognitive interventions aren't the way to go. we get to stage 2 DBT, another stage that has a lot of research behind it. Stage 2 moves beyond behavioral stabilization, focuses on healthily exposing clients to their pain, titrating regression, right? And letting them experience emotions without being overwhelmed. Here, we're starting to build a skills base for clients to use when they are getting overwhelmed. In session, we can practice that, and then eventually be able to build that toolbox so clients can tend to themselves outside of sessions. In stage 2, behaviors are stabilized. This is oftentimes where some adjunctive trauma work can happen. One thing with DBT that is a shortcoming, it's not a targeted trauma treatment. So if targeted trauma treatment is necessary, this is where something like EMDR or prolonged exposure may come into play. Stage 2 is where trauma is safely explored, maladaptive thoughts and beliefs and behaviors are identified. This too is also where we start to see hope. We're instilling and increasing hope by improving clients' ability to healthily experience emotion. Hopefully here too, being able to experience a growing sense of agency. This is where the research on DBT really falls off a cliff here. A lot of the research on DBT focuses on stage 1 mainly and stage 2. Now with stage 3 and stage 4, we'll see the research, it's remarkable how precipitously it falls off. So once traumatic stress is reduced, stage 3 focuses, this is where we focus on solving problems of everyday living. Here, the word happiness may enter the picture and really sustaining stabilization. Stage 3 focuses on achieving natural and or quote unquote ordinary happiness, maybe blowing up some of the myths of happiness that can be fed to us by an American consumerist culture. And in stage 3, client focuses on behavioral accountability, building trust in themselves, strengthening self-worth, and enhancing quality of life through reasonable goal setting. This too, I don't have the slide here for it, but this too, in conjunction with acceptance and commitment therapy, is where we can take a look at values-driven living and try to prioritize what are a person's values in service of the DBT goal of living a life worth living, and lining up those values with the behaviors and goals. And all of a sudden, we really start to move towards integration. And then the last stage of DBT, the stage 4 DBT is advanced DBT. This stage 4 DBT, it focuses on achieving transcendence and building an ongoing capacity for joy. This is where you see clients really make the skills their own. They customize skills, they stack skills. They'll come up with their own remixes and reformulations of it that are oftentimes much more brilliant than Lenahan's formulations or any clinician's formulations. And this is where spirituality, possibly seeking a spiritual advisor, might enter play. However, by no means is spirituality mandatory here. And there is very little research on stage 4 DBT. I was actually teaching at University of Utah last week, and my colleague pulled up a slide on the stages of DBT, and stage 4 wasn't even listed. So I targeted this research gap in my dissertation, advanced DBT mechanisms of change. I interviewed advanced DBT therapists, and just wonderful information came out of that dissertation. So the 4 modules of DBT. If we think of DBT as a pyramid, the base of the pyramid is mindfulness. I believe that this is one of the beautiful things with DBT, and one of the reasons it makes it so integratable in terms of that it is based on mindfulness. I think that with most, if not all, therapeutic modalities, we are dealing with mindfulness. We're dealing with the here and now, the here and now in the therapeutic arena, the here and now in terms of the here and now that the client is experiencing outside of sessions that they need to work through. And this is where I think DBT plugs and plays well with other therapies because of this mindfulness base, right? So with modern psychoanalysis, the assignment of saying everything in the here and now, right? We can see how that can fit very well into that part of the DBT pyramid. The second part is the stress tolerance. I actually like Lenahan's original conceptualization of it as crisis survival strategies. These are strategies where we are trying to survive extreme emotion. Emotional regulation is when we're in a little bit of a more stabilized space with our emotions and trying to change the mountains and canyons of emotions to more so meandering valleys and hills. And then lastly, translating the mindfulness and emotional regulation skills internally and then externalizing them to interpersonal effectiveness, learning the skills to be more mindful of ourselves, to develop metacognition, the ability to mentalize and function more effectively in our relationships with others, but as I said, coming back to our relationships with ourselves. So this core base of mindfulness, we live in an ever-changing, accelerating world. I don't know, as a Generation Xer, I don't know if there is a day that I do not feel overwhelmed by the relentless progression of technology. We're pulled in so many directions at once. If we're not pulled by our phone, we're pulled by our computer screen. I was at the gym this morning, and I looked up and I could count 17 screens. There were 5 TVs on the wall. There's a wall of screens on the treadmills in front of me. I had 4 screens in front of me: my phone, my pad, my computer, right? All pulling for my attention. I almost felt like it was invasion of the mind snatchers in a way. And it's so easy without an ongoing mindfulness practice, it's easy to go into a mindless state or a mindless life or a distracted life. An illustration of this is Netflix or whatever streaming service. A check and balance that I use for television is, am I mindfully watching TV or is the TV watching me? So am I watching my first episode of Suits and enjoying it, or has Netflix queued up the 6th one in a row, and have I just lost like 6 hours of my life to just not really participate in the show? So some core mindfulness skills that I picked out to try and illustrate the essence of mindfulness or wise mind: observing and describing, participating, non-judgmental stance, non-judgmentally and effectively. So there's 3 states of mind here with mindfulness. Emotion mind, and this is neurobiology oversimplified, but we'll say that emotion mind is generally the right hemisphere of the brain. Emotion mind is hot, mood dependent. It's really emotion focused. When we're in this state of mind, we're ruled by moods, feelings, urges. Facts, reason, and logic are not important. And on the other side is reasonable mind, which is cool, rational, and task focused. When in reasonable mind, we're not ruled by facts, reason, and logic, and their emotion and feelings are not important. For anyone who has watched Star Trek, Spock is pretty much the embodiment of reasonable mind. And then wise mind is the wisdom within each person, seeing the value of both reason and emotion, and trying to integrate left and right brain together and walk the middle path. Here's a short video on what wise mind is.
Wise mind refers to a state of mind or a state of being where you are the wisest and make the most effective decisions. We want you to learn how to recognize wise mind and how to get into that state on purpose, even when you are upset. First, let's distinguish wise mind from two other states of mind that we're frequently in: emotion mind and reasonable mind. Emotion mind is the state of mind when your emotions control your thoughts, urges, and behaviors. When you're in emotion mind, your emotions dictate your responses regardless of your long-term goals. With anger, you might lash out at someone or engage in road rage behavior. When you're in emotion mind with sadness, you might stay in bed all day and neglect your responsibilities. There are certain vulnerabilities that make you more likely to be in emotion mind, like being tired, hungry, physically ill, stressed, or under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Reasonable mind is a state of mind where reason and logic control your thoughts, urges, and behaviors. When you're in reasonable mind, facts and logic dictate your responses. When you're in reasonable mind, you might demand things go a particular way that you feel is right according to the facts. Maybe reasonable mind sounds good to you, though you have to remember that logic and facts devoid of emotions means you lose your sense of values and empathy. So in reasonable mind, you might not realize that another person is upset and do what's needed to help them. Wise mind represents the integration of emotion mind and reasonable mind. It is knowing the facts and logic in a situation, as well as tuning into emotional and sensory experiences. Similar to intuition, wise mind is often described as a centered, gut feeling felt in the body. Finding your wise mind can take a lot of practice. To practice getting into wise mind when you're in a different state of mind, you can do a number of things. One is attending to your breath coming in and out of your body and focusing your attention into your center at the bottom of your breath. You can add the words wise and mind to your in-breath and out-breath. Another exercise is to ask wise mind a question. Breathe in. Silently ask wise mind a question, and when you breathe out, just listen without giving yourself an answer. Just notice what answers come up for you. As a skill, wise mind can be incredibly useful for getting you to a more centered place where you can act more effectively.
Right. So mindfulness skills are divided into what and how skills. The what skills being what is mindfulness, and then how do we practice mindfulness. So with the skill of observe. Observe is simply what it is in terms of observing what is coming through our body sensations, what's coming through our five senses. Anyone who knows the grounding exercise through the five senses. What are five things that you see? What are four things that you smell, right? To ground people in sessions, or perhaps you've used that to ground yourself, you're very familiar with that. Paying attention with purpose to the present moment. Lenahan says, rivet yourself to the now. Control your attention, but not what you see. Push away nothing. Cling to nothing. Here we start to see some of the Buddhist roots of non-attachment here. Practice wordless watching. Watch thoughts come into your mind and let them slip right by like clouds in the sky. Notice the feeling rising and falling like waves in the ocean. And the ability to observe both inside and outside yourself. What is happening outside oneself? What is happening with our internal experience? And also when individuals gain more of a sense of agency, being able to develop the ability to focally shift, well, first realize perhaps when an individual is internalized or too internalized and accelerating themselves, perhaps with interpretations or thoughts or cognitive distortions, and then using something like five senses exercise to externalize focus, right? This could be even tied to something like asking an object-oriented question, right? To lift a client outside of themselves instead of asking a you question, being like, "Oh, what did you have for lunch today?" Right? After observing, we want to learn to describe. So putting words on the experience, saying everything about the experience. When a feeling or thought arises, just acknowledging it. So describing, wow, sadness has just enveloped me. Even before this presentation, I was saying anxiety is here, right? Just acknowledge it and not resist it, because what we resist persists. Or stomach muscles are tightening. We also want to be able to observe somatically what is going on with us. The body keeps the score. If we're extremely activated, the body in many ways is the score. So we want to develop the ability not just to observe and describe our feelings and emotions, but what's going on in our body and how our body is speaking to us. Saying everything isn't necessarily verbal, it's somatic as well. Or cognitively, a thought, I can't do this, has come into my mind. So we're just labeling what we observe, put a name on your feelings, label a thought as just a thought. A feeling is just a feeling, an action is just an action, and ungluing the interpretations and opinions from the facts. Becoming a reporter and saying what's happening, the who, what, when, where, that's observed. Just the facts. And then once we can observe and describe, that opens up the ability to check the facts, which is a way, that's a skill to help us access that rational part of our mind and not get carried away by emotion. Mindfulness skill, participate. We want to throw ourselves completely into activities of the current moment, not separate ourselves from what's going on in the moment. Such as if we're going to clean, we're going to clean. If we're going to talk to a friend, talk to the friend. If I'm going to teach a DBT class right now, I am 100% present in here. There are no spectators, right? Becoming one with whatever you're doing, completely forgetting oneself, throwing your attention to the moment, acting intuitively from a wise mind, doing just what is needed in each situation, such as a skillful dancer on a dance floor, one with the music, and be willing, going with the flow and responding with spontaneity. I really think a great way to illustrate this skill, and I use this as an education in my DBT and non-DBT group, is I educate groups that in order for us to flourish, we're going to have to participate, right? We are not going to spectate. We are going to come in here and try to do the therapeutic assignment of saying everything as a group and help everyone else say everything. And the way to do that is to participate, jump in with spontaneity. Reminds me of transference and resistance workshops that I went through in my psychoanalytic training, where we learned emotional resiliency, to speak our mind and to have differences and conflict. So I use the participate skill to really educate people on group process. Non-judgmental stance is important. We want to see but don't evaluate as good or bad. Again, just the facts, accepting each moment, accepting each emotion like a blanket spread out on the lawn, accepting both the rain and the sun that fall upon it. We want to acknowledge the difference between the helpful and the harmful, safe and the dangerous, but don't judge them. And then when we find ourselves judging, because we are judgmental creatures, judgments are important too, in terms of sometimes we need to be judgmental to stay alive, right, as an evolutionary mechanism. However, as we have developed into a more convenient lifestyle, that is not as present. However, our brains are still wired that way. So we want to be careful not to be too judgy of our judging. So with DBT, it's not about being good or bad. We always want to be asking ourselves, are we acting in an effective manner? So the goal of acting effectively, we want to be mindful of our goals in whatever situations presented and do what is necessary to achieve them, focusing on what worked, not letting emotional mind get in the way of being effective. This can be a difficult one. Learning how to play by the rules, realizing life isn't fair and that there may be things that we have to do. There may be the game that we have to play to navigate life effectively to get the objectives that we want. Right? Acting skillfully, and a big part is letting go of willfulness and sitting on your hands, not sitting on our hands, but taking action. So, big module in DBT, emotional regulation. A central focus of DBT is the targeting of emotional dysregulation. This again, too, lends to the integrability of DBT because a lot of mental presentations are centered around emotional dysregulation. So in DBT, we teach that all emotions are valid. However, we have to be able to develop the ability to realize when our emotions may not be justified. This kind of comes back to the individualized truths. And a person's emotional truth is valid. How they are feeling is valid. However, does that line up to the stimuli? Is the response in alignment with the stimuli? There's some things that make it hard to regulate emotions. We've talked about biology, right? Predisposition. Sometimes we do not have skills to regulate our emotions, and that just lets them burn and gain fire. Sometimes there's reinforcement of emotional behaviors. The environment reinforces emotions. Our family reinforces emotions. Oftentimes we reach a state of emotional overload, skills breakdown point. Vagus nerve, vagal nerve overload, right? Where our nervous system is just overloaded and we are unable to regulate emotion. This is where we're going to move to the stress tolerance protocol. And then oftentimes the myths that are imparted upon us, that are taught from our parents or other sources, that such things like emotions are dumb. Oh, I shouldn't feel emotions. Or maybe drama's cool, or I need to be dramatic to be creative. These myths and narratives about emotions that we carry with us can make it hard to regulate them as well. Some core ER skills, emotional regulation skills: observing and describing emotions, checking the facts, opposite action, and please. So we just talked about observing and describing. What happens with emotional regulation is we're taking that base mindfulness skill and applying it to emotions. Lenihan identifies 10 basic emotions, at least in her first edition book: anger, disgust, envy, fear, happiness, jealousy, love, sadness, shame, and guilt. Now, the key here is we want to increase our emotional fluency with describing and observing emotions. So, for example, in the men's group I'm currently running, we're doing a lot of work around anger, and we're learning to really locate what type of anger we are feeling. So, for example, shades of anger, everything from aggravation, annoyance, bitterness, to rage, vengefulness, wrath, right? And this is important because we can start to predict and prevent things. The example of standing in a supermarket line and observing and describing the emotions that are coming up in me. I may say, you know what, I'm feeling aggravated, or I'm feeling pretty annoyed, And that can be a clue to all of a sudden be like, okay, you know what? I need to go to some emotional regulation skills to tamp this down before this builds. Also, too, with emotions, we can start to develop what I call a therapeutic deja vu, where, oh, I've been here before, I've felt this way before. Now my spidey sense is on. Now let me go to my protocol to tend to myself. And then here's the chain analysis in terms of observing and describing emotions. It helps us identify prompting events, interpretations, biological changes and experiences of the emotions, expressions and actions of the emotions, and after effects. Checking the facts is helpful. I already spoke about this a bit in terms of how it can really help to break the chain of what are our thoughts and interpretations about the emotions that we are feeling, right? We check facts by asking, what's the emotion that I'm feeling? What's the emotion that I want to change? What's the event prompting my emotion? What are my interpretations, thoughts, and assumptions about the event? Am I assuming the threat? And what's the catastrophe? That's oftentimes an important thing to ask. In a heightened sense, it can feel like the world is ending. However, if we can take a step back and say, is there a catastrophe here? That can open up space to use skills to down-regulate ourselves. And do my emotions and or their intensity fit the actual facts? Opposite action is a skill that we use when our emotions do not fit the facts. Every emotion has an action urge. You can change the emotion by acting opposite to its action urge. So for here, we have some examples for fear. The action urge is to avoid. With the opposite action, it's to approach. So this evening was anxious, fearful of speaking in front of 52 individuals here. And here I am embodying opposite action by approaching this presentation with an open heart and an open mind. For anger, action urge is to attack, and the opposite action is to avoid and be a little nice. For sadness, classic example there is the depressive that's stuck in the bed. The action urge is to withdraw, pull the covers over the head. Opposite action is to be active. And then for shame, and shame is very corrosive, shown by Brene Brown's research. The action urge is to hide, avoid, keep secrets, and the opposite action is to tell the secret to people who will accept it. So with shame, we could even see where an opposite action to that is to say everything. Say everything in your analytic session. Say what you don't want to say in the session. Shine light in a safe environment, and that is the antidote to shame. Oftentimes, my analyst, one of his favorite things to say is, I wonder what is not being said in here. And that oftentimes really targets the shame that I need to shine light upon in my sessions. This is a big one with the ER skill. Just trying to be mindful of time. We're at 8:21. So the pre-skill is something I've been thinking a lot about. I've been doing a couple of presentations with somatic experts in terms of the body and somatics and the body keeping the score. And the pre-skill is taking care of your mind and emotions through your body. So the pre-skill, Lenahan loves her acronyms. Here, the P and the L stands for physical illness. Here, we're taking care of our body, seeing a doctor when necessary, taking prescribed medications. This also applies to chronic illnesses as well, right? Balanced eating, not eating too much or too little, eating regularly, staying away from foods that make you overly emotional. Hydrate, right? And hydrating and caffeine does not count as hydration. Avoiding mood altering substances, staying off illicit drugs, being mindful of caffeine, as I said, balanced sleep, and then getting exercise. In terms of exercise, we're not talking about becoming Arnold Schwarzenegger. We're literally talking about 15, 20 minutes of exercise a day can have a very profound effect on how we're feeling mentally. The please skill can be an assessment tool. I use it several times through the day in terms of how am I doing with my pleases. It can also be a tool in terms of, okay, what do I need to attend to? What do I really need to target? This is important too, because we live in a culture that can actually glamorize not taking care of our body. That can be a bit of like mind over matter, grind through it, burn the candle at both ends, right? Uh, However, sometimes we just need to sleep and rest. So distress tolerance skills, I'm going to accelerate a little bit through the DT skills here. They're formally known as the crisis survival strategies. The guiding principle of distress tolerance is to do no more harm. I like to use a medical system context to help people understand this. Distress tolerance I see it more as like the paramedic. This is a simple set of skills, not as extensive or nuanced as the emotional regulation skills. We can look at it as emotional regulation skills on steroids a bit, as kind of like a mental health paramedic delivering emergency room mindfulness. A lot of people view mindfulness as meditation or peacefulness. I have to say that some of my most profound experiences of mindfulness have been when I have been highly activated and able to jam my foot in the door with the stop skill, which we'll be going over shortly, and not do any more harm. We're using distress tolerance skills when we have intense pain that cannot be helped quickly. When we're at that point when we want to act on emotions, but it will make it worse. Emotion mind threatens to overwhelm. We must remain skillful. We're overwhelmed, yet demands must be met. Arousal extreme, but problems can't be solved immediately. Some core DT skills are stop skills, tip skills, radical acceptance, and willingness. Biggest skill with distress tolerance, and even I might say DBT as a whole, is this stop skill. Can we create pauses in our life between stimuli and response? There's a quote attributed to Frankl where the space between stimulus and response, that's a space for maturation and growth. The great existential psychologist Rollo May, he also talked about the power of the pause, where if we can learn to take a pause, right? If we can learn to stop, freeze, don't move a muscle, even if how we're feeling, can we not do anything and stay in control? The stop skill is not a thinking skill, it is a visual skill. When highly activated, close your eyes and picture the biggest, reddest stop sign that you can see. For me, I add blinking lights around it. That just helps make it more urgent for me. And the only point of that skill is to stop in your tracks and not do anything. Then take a step back from the situation, take a deep breath, do what we need to do to ground ourselves. And here is where I remix the stop skill. I call it the stutter stop skill because we may need to go through the S and the T over and over and over again until, guess what? Here comes the mindfulness skills of observing and describing, noticing what's happening inside and outside of you, right? And then when we can, proceed mindfully. If we can jam our foot in the door and start to create choice where choice isn't before with the stop skill, that is a huge, huge step forward. I think Rollo May, he says it more beautifully than I'm going to paraphrase it right now, but he says with the power of the pause, we can pause and then throw our weight behind the option that we want to choose. So I think it really speaks to the power of the pause and conviction and gathering oneself instead of just being a slave to stimuli and response. The tip skill is a good example of how DBT can be a very physical therapy. Here, we're changing our body chemistry through temperature change to calm down fast. Here, we're holding our breath and putting our face in a bowl of ice water or holding a cold pack of water on our eyes and cheeks for 30 minutes. Cold and feeling cold is a way to reset ourselves. Another way to reset ourselves is intense exercise to calm down your body when it's revved up by emotion. So engaging in intense exercise only for a few minutes, spending physical energy. So walking fast, running in place, exercising, getting physical. For myself, the form of this is I do 50 jumping jacks. If I'm super upset or super angry, I do 50 jumping jacks. All of a sudden, that's a way to externalize myself because I'm outside, I'm out of breath, I'm focused on, wow, I can't breathe. All of a sudden, I'm out of that internal world. Paced breathing and paired muscle relaxation are two other parts of the tip skill there. Again, all these hyperlinks in blue, we'll flesh these out more for individuals that want to go through the slides. Just check how many. Okay, great. Oh, whoop. Yeah. Let me go back here. All right, the radical acceptance. So here we come back to that basis of acceptance with DBT. And also too, the modern psychoanalytic attitude of accepting our clients in saying everything and providing the holding environment for that to happen, which I think can be a very profound act of love. It can be a very, very profound act of love to provide that space, an intimate space, a safe space for a client to be themselves and radically accept who they are. But radical acceptance towards life is an attitude of meaning we're radically accepting life all the way, complete and total. Stop fighting reality. Stop throwing temper tantrums because reality is not the way that we want it. So what has to be accepted? Reality is as it is. The facts about the past and the present are the facts, even if you don't like them. Something that connects to this is even if we are not responsible for the trauma that was given to us, we are responsible for treating ourselves for finding the solution to it, right? Or not the solution, but learning to manage it, learning to integrate it. And a big thing too is life can be worth living, even with painful events in it. Actually, the pain can add an element of life worth living if we can find purpose and meaning behind it. Just want to highlight on the bottom here, radical acceptance is not agreement, it's not approval, it's not compassion, not passivity or against change. An important thing with DBT and also modern psychoanalysis is, and other treatments, is the attitude of willingness. We have to be able to get to a place of willingness versus willfulness. However, clinicians have to be adept and seek wisdom, really clinical wisdom, as to how to work with willfulness, right? Willingness is readiness to enter and participate fully in life and living, doing just what is needed. in each situation without dragging your feet, listening to your wise mind and then acting from it. And here again, having the awareness that we're interconnected to the ecosystems we're involved in, right? Being able to mentalize that we are all interconnected and our behaviors and what we do have a profound impact in the systems that we move through. This is oftentimes a therapeutic gain that I see in the more advanced stages of DBT. On the other side, willfulness is refusing to tolerate the moment, giving up, doing the opposite of what works, being ineffective, trying to be in control and fix every situation. And here we have attachment to me, what I want right now. So interpersonal effectiveness, I'm going to mention just briefly in service of time. We're at 8:33, but interpersonal effectiveness is relationship effectiveness. So once we have emotional regulation skills, mindfulness skills, and distress tolerance skills, the ability to tolerate distress in relationship, in conflict, right? Then we can broaden that skill set out to communicating better, getting our wants and needs met more effectively in relationship, knowing our boundaries, knowing our identity too, knowing ourselves. Oftentimes, a classic hallmark of borderline presentations is identity diffusion, organizing ourselves consistently around the wants and needs of others. Interpersonal effectiveness helps out with that. That module, relationship effectiveness, helps out with that in terms of knowing our boundaries and being able to reinforce them, set them, reinforce them. And in relationships that don't adhere or respect boundaries, end them if they end up to be toxic or interfering. So this brings us to the future of DBT, which I really strongly believe is in integration. And I strongly believe DBT, the integration, my own lived experience in integrating it with modern psychoanalytic theory and practice and technique has been profound. Before I did my dissertation, my question was, what's after DBT? There's what's going to happen after it? What's going to be the next acronym? Is it going to be ACT? Is it going to be something else? And after studying advanced DBT and interviewing wise DBT clinicians, I really feel like it's come full circle. And in this fourth wave of behaviorism, if a fourth wave is necessary, what we're moving towards is high fidelity integrative DBT. DBT that's not eclectic, that's not necessarily watered down with too much eclecticism. However, that it's really integrative and is mindful of the intersectionality and synergies with modalities like modern psychoanalysis, existential integrative psychotherapy, internal family systems, as I mentioned, thematic, etc. I think that the more that we are able to have inclusive conversations about DBT with modalities like modern psychoanalysis, and not be so divisive and tribal with our modalities, that's the way forward. And even on a micro scale, I'm curious, like the future of DBT lies with individual clinicians and our own lived experiences and how we integrate it into our practices with whatever other primary modalities that we are working with. And I'm really excited to see what those possibilities are in terms of I guess, the second half of my career as I move into my second half of practice and teaching and seeing what comes of this next wave. I was going to talk more about my dissertation. However, we're up on time. I want to leave time for questions and answers. However, the link to my dissertation is there in the slides. If you want some light bedtime reading, you can read about advanced DBT mechanisms of change and the themes that came out of it. However, just real quickly, I'll just highlight the therapeutic relationship, right? Acceptance, validation, right? Therapeutic use of self in terms of the modern analyst doing what is necessary, not being the blank slate and an interpretive entity, but what is necessary from the analyst in the here and now of the session to be effective. We can see here where these mechanisms of change, there's congruencies that may not be apparent upon first examination. And then this goes into dissertations a little bit further. Lastly, with everything, as my voice gets a little bit hoarse, I want to close out with a lot of gratitude. I'm so thankful. First off, I'm just so thankful for my education at PSP and the wonderful individuals that taught me and my cohort, especially people that did 4 years of transference and resistance workshop with me, where I really cut my therapeutic teeth. And I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to bring this information full circle, excuse me, to my alma mater here. And I hope that I've been able to light some fires, and I hope to be able to continue this conversation both individually, if this piques your interest and you wish to contact me, my email is right there. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. My YouTube has various videos on there, and then I'm also starting to write on medium.com. So I want to thank everyone here. I want to thank you, Lisa, for giving me the space here, and looking forward to some questions and answers. I'll answer them the best I can with whatever voice I have left.
Okay, Dr. Deussing, we have several questions here. Most of them seem to be around more of the integration with modern psychoanalysis or psychodynamics, where you see DBT integrating. I don't know that you'll be able to enter into all that specifically, but one question was requesting a specific example, clinical example, how to integrate psychodynamics and DBT.
Right. Let me just take a sip of water here. So I can do this in one of two ways or both. If we want to do the in more of a macro sense, a case comes to mind where oftentimes courses of DBT treatment or treatment can be cyclic. So I had a client who initially came to me and was failing out of school, and also very suicidal and just trying to stay alive, a lot of self-harm. And our first course of treatment was adherent DBT for 1.5, 2-year course of treatment, which is a pretty standard. And with that, it was straight up DBT, straight up diary cards, straight up behavioral functioning, all of that. Ends up patient stabilized, symptom reduction, and graduated. Cool. So fini, done, discharge, right? About 1.5 years later, client calls back up and says, I'm running into difficulties with relationship. I'm having trouble with work. I'm having trouble. And the second course of treatment became much more free-flowing and much more psychoanalytic in terms of the skills were already uploaded, right? So sessions then, there was no diary card anymore. Client would come in, lay, say, pay, right? And it could be much more of a mix between the two. If the client wanted to target something specifically in the second stint, they could say, oh, I want to move more towards behavioral stuff. However, as we've moved into the more insight-oriented stuff, we talked a lot more about the 2 years that she spent institutionalized in her high school years, and the identity work, the identity that got fused to that, right? Saying everything around that, going into past experiences, realizing the insight between how that identity has fused with her current identity, and really working to separate and individuate the two through saying everything around that. Realizing too that a lot more talk about her father, who was very, very ill. I call BPD squared with the bipolar type, bipolar type 1, rapid cycling with also severe borderline personality disorder presentation. So talking a lot about family of origin and things that we did not talk about in that first stint of treatment. In a more microscopic way, to think about an in-session example. So a session with me, with one of my clients right now, would not be, here's your diary card. Okay, here's the targeted behaviors. Here's the self-harm. It can start out as, oh, so what's going on? Let's say everything. And as a narrative happens, if I'm seeing behaviors or something like, oh, I was thinking about drinking, and then we can move towards targeting that. It's a contact functions there, Ray. That's one thing too that I forgot to mention. A core thing is, where is the contact function? Is the client contacting me for a behavioral intervention, or are they contacting just for a holding space to be able to speak out loud, right? And maybe say, okay, you have had the impulse to drink, now you've said it on the couch. That in itself is the behavioral intervention. Does that elucidate it at all, those two examples?
I think that probably gives a closer, more of, I think probably. If that didn't, please re-ask the question. There was another question about transference in DBT and the use of transference.
Right. So transference, not in the DBT manual. It's okay. Not really discussed in terms of a DBT consult team. However, this is where there can be a little bit of misconception around the rigidity of DBT. So for example, my DBT team, integrative DBT and psychotherapy, at our consultation meeting, we are always talking about the transferential field and countertransference, transference, maybe not in those terms per se, but I can't, if I had a nickel for every time I said to a supervisee, how are you feeling about the patient? How are you feeling about the treatment? What indicators are there for us to pay attention to, instead of just immediately moving to, oh, DBT interventions? That's a big part of our conversation. So one DBT consult team can be very, very different from another. A completely adherent DBT practice, countertransference, transference may even be a dirty word that's not discussed. We're here to talk strict DBT. In my practice, I'm always looking to talk about transference, countertransference, how we're feeling in session, right? Because there's so much clinical information there. And two, even to think about the therapist developing the ability to regulate their countertransferences, maybe even using some DBT skills themselves or mindfulness skills in session, slowing it down. I've used the stop skill when sometimes I've wanted to say something, I've been caught in an enactment or a countertransferential murkiness, and all of a sudden I want to say something. I literally close my eyes, stop skill, and let it be. So I think there was another question that came up here in the chat.
Sorry,
Or
yeah,
did
there
you
was
have?
another one there about, oh, did you have it?
There's a lot here. Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of great questions. How do I assess? How do I determine which patients I recommend modern psychoanalytic treatment versus DBT? And do I make the differences explicit so the patient can choose? Yeah, I think this one can be tied directly to the stages of DBT in terms of if an individual is functioning at a higher stage of DBT. That's where some of the structure in the manualized protocol can fall away, and we can follow more of a modern psychoanalytic treatment paradigm. Do I make the differences explicit? Not necessarily, no. And this is where I think some of the artistry of being a therapist comes into play. One of my clients, she said something to the effect of, uh, you break up the DBT so it doesn't even seem like DBT. And that's included in a conversational dynamic, like a dynamic that doesn't feel clinical. And this is where I think the art comes into play in terms of being able to act from DBT principles and grounding in DBT theory, but be able to also have a dialogue and a holding space that doesn't feel clinical and behaviorally targeted, right? And being able to do that organically, not forcing it in terms of, oh, this is what we need to target. Right? Sometimes though, I will explicitly ask a patient what they need, and also too explicitly ask a patient what they don't need as well. Sometimes I've been surprised by patients saying, well, or implying we're moving too quickly to down-regulating. Sometimes things don't need to be down-regulated so quickly. Sometimes we just need to breathe and say everything around that. You know?
I don't know if you're going through the chat, but there was one ask that came up as you were talking about shame and DBT, and if you would like to talk a little bit more about how you might address that clinically.
Yeah, with shame, I think one of the first things with shame is identifying it, right? And being able to educate individuals about the difference between shame and guilt, which oftentimes I find people get confused about, and realizing that shame is corrosive, whereas guilt is externalized in terms of I've done something that doesn't align with who I am, whereas shame is internalized and saying I am the flaw, I am the mistake. So in terms of DBT working with shame, we really want to become fluent about the difference between shame and guilt, and learning skills to be able to pull ourselves out of shame spirals. A lot of times, shame can feed in upon itself and lead to self-harm behaviors. So oftentimes the shame, I'm teaching people, okay, let's recognize when we're going into a shame spiral, either preventatively or recognizing, oh, we're in it. And how can we realize that we're in the swamp? This is not an area that we want to stick in, right? We're here, we have our waders on. Okay, what skills are we going to apply to move through this shame and shine light? Also, too, honestly, shame, I think one of the biggest things in working with shame is not necessarily DBT, but coming into session and saying everything, particularly the things that we do not want to say or that we want to hide from our analyst and hide from ourselves. One thing that I remember Dr. Ellis had told me that I will never forget is everyone lies. Everyone lies in session. And so trying to minimize that and be saying, okay, it's okay to be all of yourself in here. The shameful parts, the light, the dark. This isn't a performative art. Dr. Tamarin, you want me to give a clinical example? Was the example I gave granular enough or specific, or are you seeking
No,
more?
not really. Not really. And the other thing I wanted to find out is you've talked a lot about DBT and yourself. And it sounds like DBT has had a dramatic effect on the way you conduct your life and how you experience it. And I'm wondering whether it's had a much more profound effect on the way you live your life than psychoanalysis, because it sounds that way from your talk.
No, not at all. I actually would credit psychoanalysis with saving my life in terms of earlier when I first came to psychoanalysis. I was failing out of my master's program in graduate school. It was in a very bad way and did not do DBT at all. Spent years on the couch, spent years at PSP, learning the assignments and doing the experiential trainings. And through that, got to a space where I finished school, really worked through a lot of shame and a lot of trauma. And then after that, became part of a DBT team. And I think then the DBT integrated with the modern psychoanalysis, the psychoanalytic process. And so that's where I find myself today in terms of what helps. I don't think it's that binary for me in terms of DBT's helped me more. I actually think it's more of a holistic picture between the two modalities. And two, what the dialectic places me in, and this is one thing that I found with DBT and modern psychoanalysis, oftentimes that dialectic places me into the existential and humanistic, that middle path of that dialectic where I'm asking questions about my life, purpose of my life, who am I, my identity, right? My values, my goals as I move into these different stages of my life. And that is a very heady mix and offers a lot of different ways to work with existence. I can work with my existence in an insight-oriented fashion. I know where my trauma comes from, my intergenerational trauma. I can also work with my current behavioral existence in terms of what's my daily behavioral existence. If I need to do that, I can go to the DBT. If I want to go to the really deeper and heavier questions and think about things of like freedom, liberation, death, right? Denial of death, purpose, meaning in life, then I can go into that existential, that EIP stuff. The somatics too is another element that's increasing in my life. So I don't know, John, I think it's an ongoing journey, but my apologies if that was a misrepresentation to you in this presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, but analysis saved my life. I don't know what I would have done without Dr. Linda Guerra and Dr. Stuart Hockenberry. Saved my fucking life. Thank God to be here today and share this with you.
Stuart Hockenberry.
I heard something about 3 minutes till 9 o'clock.
I was
Please.
going to say, I feel like that might be a good place to kind of wrap up for the evening, is if that feels okay to you, Dr. Deussing.
Yes, yeah. I wish I had a little more time to get a little bit more granular. I almost feel like I could have given more, and I'll strive to do this in future presentations, a little bit more attention and mindfulness to the integration part of it. However, I was really trying to pack as much DBT in here as much as possible. Perhaps
Yes.
I was a little bit overzealous there.
Well, that's what we wanted, and that's what I had asked you for, really, because for a lot of us, I don't know how many, but I suspect a lot of us have not had much exposure to DBT. So it's really good to learn about a different method. And, this just gives us an excuse to invite you back if you want to flesh some more things out. I hope that you'll consider coming back again and talking with us. I appreciate
Yeah.
all that you have said tonight, how you've shared yourself, and I appreciate your generosity in sharing the slides. Not everyone does that, and I know that people will be delving into them. And I also appreciate that you started with a mindfulness exercise, so that we had an experiential moment, which we don't often get with presentations on Zoom. So it was you really covered a lot of territory, gave us a lot to think about our work and even ourselves. So I appreciate it. Thank you so very much. And if I can say thank you again to everyone who has joined us from all over the world. And I want to say a special thank you to our board members who attended tonight, our society members, our student candidates. Thank you very much for attending. And there'll be a message that'll go out tomorrow with some more information about Dr. Deussing's practice and how to contact him, and the slides will be included. And then at a later date, we will send out the recording. We just have to make sure there's no edits that need to be made, and we'll make that available for everyone as well.
Right. And we'll see if we can make me better looking in the recording. Maybe. I really enjoyed everyone here. This was a difficult bridge to try and connect the two. I appreciate everyone's patience, and thank you so much. And I hopefully will see you in future presentations. I would love to come back and get more granular. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.